Welcome to our presentation this evening on climate adaptation. I think this is the 12th in our series of presentations that we've co-sponsored with the Maryland Climate Coalition. So tonight we have three practitioners of climate adaptation. And I find it a fascinating subject on a number of accounts. One is, to do it well, you really need to understand the science. To manage a risk, you need to know what the risk is. Secondly, to do it well, you have to design with nature. Otherwise, it doesn't last, or it does harm, perhaps to a neighbor's property. So it has to be done with nature. It has to be designed with nature. And I think that's a lesson that we're being forced to go back to, that traditional view of our relationship with relationship with nature, that it doesn't work to be a predator on nature, to put it bluntly. And third, I find it fascinating because, again, you have to understand the science, but that leads you to recognize that there's an underlying problem, a big problem that we have. So being aware of climate adaptation leads one to consider climate mitigation. So it's an important and interesting subject. So we have three practitioners tonight with us. We have Zoe Johnson, who will speak first. And Zoe's with NOAA and also with the assigned to the Chesapeake Bay program, where she heads up the climate adaptation effort there. Our second speaker will be Sasha Land. Sasha is with Maryland DNR and works in communities that are subject to climate change impacts. And then our last speaker will be Karl Schrass, who's with the National Wildlife Federation. And the speakers would prefer that we hold our questions to the end. So if you have questions, jot them down. We'll go through the panel, and then we'll have, I'm sure, a nice long time to talk among ourselves. All right, Zoe.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here. And do these actually stand or sit? How do you advance your slides without boxing?
I can do that if you want.
Well, I'll just look for the arrow. I can move this way.
Or just hit the
Okay. That'll work. So, good evening. My name is Zoe Johnson. I like to say it again, just gives me a little bit of comfort introducing myself to the crowd, breaks the ice a little bit. I have worked on climate change adaptation issues here in the state of Maryland since 1998, when I arrived as a coastal management fellow through NOAA to write a strategy for the state of Maryland on how to address sea level rise. And I spent 2 years as a fellow writing that strategy, and then another, I don't know, 10 or so years implementing the strategy, and then beginning to work on a lot of other issues associated with climate change adaptation outside of the coastal zone. And then I just sort of continued working on different aspects of climate change adaptation until I landed at the Chesapeake Bay program about 1.5 years ago to coordinate a much broader effort associated with climate change, looking at how climate change is affecting the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed, and how we can, what we need to do to gain a better understanding of the trends and impacts on the watershed, and then how we can build resilience to those impacts. So I'm going to share with you just a little bit about some of the work that we're doing. But first, we're going to spend, each of us are going to spend about 20 minutes giving a presentation. I can talk fast and I can talk long, so maybe Sasha can cut me off if I go too fast or if I go too long. But we just want to set the stage for you first about what some of the impacts, the broad scale impacts are that are affecting the Chesapeake watershed, and then we'll bring it home in Sasha's presentation and Karl's presentation to really talk about more localized impacts and what's happening in the state of planning and natural nature-based work that Karl works on. But some of the big issues that are facing the Chesapeake Bay region are sea level rise. We have seen over a foot of sea level rise over the last century. About half of that rate is due to regional land subsidence, and I could spend a lot of time talking about what goes into measuring sea level rise, but I'll spare you those details. And if you're interested in learning more about sea level rise or sea level rise projections, you can follow up later. But there's definitely a lot of science that goes into looking at historic observations of sea level rise and then projecting future rates of sea level rise into the future, and a lot of factors associated with greenhouse gas emissions as well as the regional land subsidence component that's happening here in the Chesapeake. We also have seen documented increase in water temperature in the Chesapeake, about 2 degrees annual average increase over the last 60 years, and those trends are continuing. We've just launched a project at NOAA's Chesapeake Bay office to develop a bay temperature climate indicator that's going to help us track and measure temperature within the Chesapeake Bay using high-resolution satellite data. So it's an interesting project you might be interested in learning more about. But we really are beginning to understand that the bay temperatures are increasing and they're having effects on the species and the resources that we manage. And then this region, as you know, has seen as sort of an uptick in sort of extreme events. They're not any one given extreme event like a hurricane or a nor'easter or extreme heat wave can be tied to climate change, but the continuation of those trends is something that's being tracked. But what we use those extreme events for in terms of adaptation is really we use them to sort of foreshadow or demonstrate the types of impacts that we're vulnerable to where we're vulnerable in this region and the types of planning and programs we need to put in place to reduce that vulnerability. So a couple more impacts just quickly. The National Climate Assessment that came out in 2014 showed that this region, the Northeast region, has seen a 71% increase in these high precipitation but short duration events. These are these, they call them rain bombs. There are a lot of terms that have been coming to bear when we talk about these types of precipitation events. These are this Ellicott City last summer was a devastating impact. They're very hard to predict. They can be very devastating. There was some loss of life. The summer before, I think it was, that there was an event that flooded Baltimore area, the airport, the parking areas in the airport. So these, they overwhelm our storm drains and can cause havoc. But this region, it's interesting to see because people they're becoming much more conscious of these types of events. But when you actually look at the data and analyze the trends, that this region is seeing an increase in those trends. It's something that we're aware of and the need to plan for that. Another issue that's being monitored and tracked by NOAA, as well as the Union of Concerned Scientists, another group that's doing a lot of work on looking at climate change and climate change impacts, is an increase in nuisance flooding. So this is also something that people in Annapolis and Baltimore are much more conscious of. Are sort of these these small but nuisance, they call them nuisance. They're pain. They're not causing structural damage. They're not flooding buildings. But some roads are getting flooded, and there's some obviously some impacts to navigation. But when you look at the trends as well, that today Annapolis is experiencing almost 50 days a year of nuisance flooding. And that when you then take into account, and that's what these two reports do, they take into account future projections of sea level rise, and they show how over time that increase in sea level rise is going to cause an increase in the number of nuisance flood events. So if we see 5.5 inches of sea level rise by 2030, which is a pretty conservative estimate, we could see as many as 180 days a year of nuisance flooding in Annapolis. So it's just a way, and this is what most of the trend analysis for climate change does, is it looks at historic observed events or data, and then we use climate projections based on different emission scenarios of carbon to think about and to project how those observed climate changes may change in the future. So that's just an example of that. Also, some impacts of climate change that we're paying a lot of attention to in the Chesapeake Bay right now is the impact of changes on water supply and the impact of climate change on water quality. So I'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, but towards the end of my presentation. But there are a lot of issues with water supply. We're going to see too much water when we don't need it, and potentially drought conditions in summer when we do need it. So, and with increasing temperature, there's definitely an increase in evapotranspiration. So we're not retaining that water in the aquifers in our stream systems in Western Maryland when we need it. So which brings me to impacts on what we call high quality cold water resource areas. These are our brook trout streams in the western portion of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. These streams are seeing impacts associated with drought, but most notably they're seeing increases in temperature. And the brook trout is a very critical threshold, which I should know, but I'm forgetting. The temperature for viability with brook trout is very limited, and so many of these species are being squeezed out, and there's a tremendous amount of work going on by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to map these brook trout catchment areas and ensure that we're trying, and how you would build adaptation into a resilience into a system like this is trying to maintain that forest cover or vegetated cover over those streams to keep them cool, and also prevent or reduce the amount of impervious surface that's draining into those streams, because when water hits hot pavement, it increases that water temperature. So there's a lot of activity going around protecting these cold water species and these cold water habitats. The bay itself, in terms of that warming that I talked about, the 2 degrees increase in warming, it's not constant, it's not steady, so there definitely are some extremes that we're picking up. And those extreme events can be devastating for our submerged aquatic vegetation, which is prime nursery habitat. We're also seeing changes in the types of species. More invasive species are moving into the system, and even some changes in the types of bay and aquatic species. Another issue, which is sort of on the front, which we don't have a good understanding on, but we're beginning to learn more and detect and set up some observation systems around, is acidification. So as the pH of the bay changes, there's changes in the salinity. It's called carbon. It's called acidification. That it can potentially impact our biocarbonate species, such as oysters and blue crab to some extent. And so there are a couple of new observation platforms that have been put in the chop tank. This past summer, the University of Maryland did a cruise throughout the Chesapeake, picking up ocean acidification monitoring data throughout the Chesapeake. And there's now just a new group that's been formed called the Mid-Atlantic Coastal Acidification Network to gain a better, to install more monitoring networks to gain a better understanding about the potential impacts of acidification on the Chesapeake. Another issue that we have worked on when I was at I don't know if I mentioned this, that I spent most of my career at the Department of Natural Resources. We spent a tremendous amount of time there working on the impacts of sea level rise on the effects on marshes on the eastern shore. So as sea level inundates the eastern shore and these marsh habitats, and the land subsidence is occurring in that same area, you will see what starts to happen is that these marshes will start breaking up from the inside. There'll be this inner pond formation that starts happening, and then wind and wave action from any given storm, the marsh systems will begin to erode from the inside out. And what happens is that due to saltwater intrusion, those loblolly pines, will begin to die off, and you begin to see tremendous amount if you've driven down to Blackwater Wildlife Refuge. You can see some pretty expansive networks of these loblolly pines that have been dying off. So I should mention on all of these impacts, there's a dedicated adaptation effort or program that's directed towards it in terms of research or policy or planning that's underway in the Chesapeake. So I kind of go over all these slides just to give you a flavor for the types of issues and a flavor for the types of activities that are underway to either get a better understanding of the impacts or to specifically direct our attention towards better preparedness or planning. Another issue that's predominant throughout the Chesapeake Bay is erosion. Maryland loses about 580 acres a year to erosion. We have expanses like this. I took this picture down, got chiggers on the site visit as well. So that's just one job hazard. But the is this, this guy was losing up to 8 acres a year. And obviously it was a, well, I think it was a 500-acre farm down on Taylor's Island. But he's looking for a solution. He's looking for a solution how to protect this shoreline at a cost he can afford when he has 500 acres. So definitely, it's large expanses there are some areas along Maryland that lose up to 8 acres, 8 feet a year of erosion. And Karl's going to talk about this, as well as probably Sasha, some of the efforts that we had to help communities as well as other landowners deal with this chronic erosion that's happening. Another issue, and this is going to be what Sasha focuses her presentation on, are the impacts of sea level rise, coastal storms, flooding, erosion on our coastal communities. So this is a picture of Smith Island, which is sort of our last inhabited iconic community in Maryland's portion of the Chesapeake Bay. I have spent a lot of time on Smith Island. I spent probably 3 years working with them on the development of a vision plan for their community in the face of sea level rise and coastal erosion. It's a fascinating case study, but really it brings home the issues that we're facing here in the Chesapeake with the threat of these impacts associated with climate change on real communities. And so Sasha is going to talk about the Co-Smart Communities program that works with communities like Smith Island on some of these issues. But just some of the take-home messages when it comes to climate change and thinking about the trends here in the Chesapeake. Last March, we put on a workshop with bringing together some of the leading scientists from around the Chesapeake Bay region and even outside to inform the Chesapeake Bay program on climate change and the projections that we should be using to guide our work moving forward. And so I put these up here. They're pretty big and sort of overarching messages, but they hopefully will stick with you. And that is that the Northeast region is getting warmer and wetter, and that the precipitation is becoming much more intense. So we haven't necessarily seen an increase in precipitation in some years. Some models, when we look to the future in terms of precipitation, we may see a 2% increase, and other models may show us a 2% decrease. But what the models and what our observations are showing us is that the intensity of these precipitation events is increasing. And that we know that the trends are going to continue for decades. It isn't really until about year 2050, and this is this point here, that there's a large sensitivity to emission scenarios when it comes to carbon, but not really until the year 2050. So between now and 2050, the projections for temperature, sea level rise, precipitation are pretty consistent. They begin to diverge, and if you look at a sea level rise curve, they begin to diverge around the year 2050, where there's much more uncertainty in terms of what we will do as a society to reduce greenhouse gases and carbon. Another issue in this area is that natural variability is extremely important and extremely critical, particularly when it comes to precipitation. So we're facing some issues associated with climate change, long-term trends associated with carbon and climate change, but in this region and in other regions such as Washington State and other places on the globe, there are these interdecadal or seasonal climate patterns that influence our weather. So these are El Niños and La Niñas and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And so over the last 30 years, much of the climate variability that we have seen in this region is due to some of these shorter term climate variability cycles. And so when we think about climate change in the future, you can't just take the last 30 years and project it into the future, because you have to take into account some of these interdecadal and other seasonal climate patterns. So it's very tricky. And then another take-home message is that in this region, sea level is rising faster than other places, and that's most notably due to the land subsidence that's occurring in this region. But there's some other factors in terms of glacial melt that could be potentially influencing the Gulf Stream and causing water to bulge along the mid-Atlantic. And then a major take-home message, and this really, is what we needed to ensure that we had the support for our work, was that there was this message that we needed to build capacity within the Chesapeake Bay program to ensure that we had the data and the information to plan and learn and adapt to these changes. So anyway, I told Phil I was going to give you a little bit of Climate Change 101 in terms of what mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency is. Because I understand that this group has spent a lot of time talking about mitigation. supporting, Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act and the, RPS standards. So mitigation is really reducing those drivers of climate change. Adaptation is what we're talking about tonight, and that is how do we adapt to the changes that are already occurring and that are projected to increase in the future. Specifically, adapting to changes in order to reduce vulnerability and reduce harm. Resiliency is a little bit different than adaptation. It's very closely aligned. A lot of adaptation work is messaged around resiliency. Resiliency is how to recover and adapt and respond to any sort of dramatic event or catastrophic event. It doesn't necessarily need to be climate. We need to be resilient to, downfall in the stock market or an earthquake. But in climate resiliency, we're really thinking about how we can plan and absorb and recover from climatic events. But we also still need to think about, people that can argue this to death, that there's definitely a difference between adaptation and resiliency. In my mind, they're pretty closely aligned. But resiliency lends itself a little bit more when we're talking about natural systems, how to ensure that our natural systems are able to recover. And Karl will talk about that as well. And I understand that Sasha also has this slide. This is a pretty classic slide that we use to kind of define some of the different areas of adaptation planning when it comes to planning, land use planning, and working with communities. So I won't spend too much time on it, but these are kind of the sectors that a lot of the work on adaptation happens around: transportation, disaster planning, natural resource management, where we do our work, building codes, but I won't steal Sasha's thunder. So in 2014, the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, which is kind of the keystone agreement between the state's jurisdictions within the Chesapeake Bay watershed and the federal government, was re-signed on a very hot day. And for the first time, there was a specific goal that was added to the Bay Agreement that addressed climate resiliency. And the goal is very broad because climate resiliency and the issue of climate change is very broad and affects so much of the Bay and its resources. And so the goal is to increase the resiliency of the Bay's watershed, including its living resources, habitats, public infrastructure, and communities to withstand adverse impacts from changing environmental and climate conditions. And we have two outcomes. So there are 10 other goals in the Bay Agreement, and there are 31 outcomes, and we have 2 of those outcomes. One is monitoring and assessing the impacts. We're working hard to assess the impact, the trends associated with climate change, and how they are impacting the Bay and its resources. But most importantly, and this is what I've been spending the bulk of my time on, is how is this last part of this sentence here, and that's how is climate change affecting our existing restoration effort. So how is climate change affecting our ability to attain our other goals that we've laid out in the Bay Agreement? I can give you some other examples, but most notably, we're looking at how climate change is affecting our ability to attain our water quality attainment goals. And then we have a specific outcome on adaptation. What are the projects that we need to pursue, design, and construct to enhance the resiliency to these impacts that I've been talking about? It gets a little bit bureaucratic and it gets a little bit complicated, and you have to spend a lot of time making a lot of tables to show all these connections. But as I mentioned, there are 31 outcomes, 10 goals in the agreement, and my job really is to think about this, how to integrate consideration of climate change into the entire Chesapeake Bay program. So the items in red are where we've spent some pretty devoted time over the last year and a half focusing in on how climate change is affecting our water quality goals. What do we need to do with our black duck habitat on the eastern shore to maintain wetlands in the face of sea level rise so that we have enough wetland habitat to maintain a black duck population? Brook trout I talked about in terms of what do we need to do in terms of protecting the temperature within those brook trout streams. Wetlands, both tidal and non-tidal wetlands, are threatened by changes in precipitation, and our tidal wetlands are being lost due to sea level rise when they can't move. They can't keep pace with sea level rise or move upland. We have a project or a workshop coming up in a week to look at how we're monitoring our blue crab populations and assessing catch limits and what do we need to keep in mind when it comes to monitoring for climate change. Same with oysters. How is ocean acidification affecting our oyster industry? fish habitat, how are submerged aquatic vegetation or the nursery habitat within our wetlands being affected by climate change. Climate change and diversity issues. A lot of our vulnerable communities are also vulnerable to climate change, and so we have a devoted project right now looking at some areas and some projects to help look at diversity issues associated with the human communities. And I could go on, but you can see that everything that we do within the Chesapeake Bay program, everything that goes on within a planning program at any state or local government, climate change touches. And so what I wanted to do is just really to give you a flavor for what adaptation is and how we're going about integrating consideration of climate change into these programs within the Chesapeake. But I'm going to leave you with a little bit more on the Chesapeake Bay just to kind of illustrate what's happening with regard to water quality. If folks are familiar with the Bay program and with the water quality program that's underway in the midpoint assessment for the Chesapeake Bay total daily maximum load, which is our what we need to do and put the practices we need to put in place by 2025 to achieve these water quality goals, we had a charge to look at how climate change would be affecting the increased nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment coming into the bay due to changes in climate, and then how the bay itself was going to respond to those changes due to the impacts within the bay itself, being increased temperature and changes in wetland habitats. And so there's a tremendous amount of modeling going on, and then a lot of policy when it comes to, once we have an understanding of those changes in loads and how our water quality practices are performing under different climate change scenarios, what are our options in terms of the policy? So it gets pretty complicated. But just to break it down for you, these are the kind of considerations that we have sort of devoted programs to right now. And the first is the modeling component. And so the modeling is we're relying on the guidance that came out of that scientific and technical workshop that I talked about to assess how climate change is affecting our current water quality standards for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. And we're looking at those precipitation changes that I talked about, both the increased potential volume as well as intensity of storms. We're looking at temperature increase, both on the land, how it may relate to evapotranspiration, taking water off of the surface, as well as temperature increases within the bay itself. We're looking at sea level rise, how sea level rise may affect the hydrodynamics or the mixing of the Chesapeake Bay, as well as how sea level rise may result in wetlands that are absorbing nutrients. So that's all factored into the modeling. And then we're also looking at how climate change is going to affect the effectiveness of our existing best management practices, our stormwater projects or our agricultural BMPs or our forested buffers, the practices that are put in place by state and local governments to protect against water quality impairments. We're trying to gain an understanding of how climate change is affecting the effectiveness of those projects, and then to provide specific guidance to engineers and to state and local governments on how they could better site or design those best management practices to reduce vulnerability associated with climate change. So there's a tremendous amount of investment going into, say, designing a stormwater system. You want to make sure that that stormwater system is designed given precipitation patterns that may happen over the next 50 years or the intended life of that design. And then, as I mentioned, we're working on the policy front to explore what are our options for in terms of how to allocate what could be potential increased loads associated with phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment. And then that's what we call our qualitative option. Basically would require potentially increased level of effort in terms of the number of BMPs that may be needed to reduce those water quality impairments. But also we're looking at programmatic options in terms of how to give or how to require that jurisdictions look at both BMP performance as well as siting and design standards when it comes to climate change. So that just kind of gives you a feel for how you take an issue like climate change, how you run it through the water quality planning cycle, and how you use the science to inform your models, to look at some of what, how it's impacting our research, our restoration effort, and then specifically what do we need to do to adapt. So I'm going to end there. I can talk about any of the efforts that we have underway. It's pretty fascinating when you break it all down. But basically, there's a lot of terms too. That one of the things that you can think about when you think about climate change is making things climate smart. That's a term that's often used. But there's also, I went to a workshop a number of years ago that said ask the climate question. In anything that you do, you want to think about climate change and what you need to do to make yourself more resilient or more adaptable. But I'll leave you with this. We do have a newsletter. It comes out quarterly. It's called Chesapeake Resiliency. Find it on our website. But really, it's an information source on what we're doing, what's going on. We collect a lot of information about projects underway and upcoming workshops and all sorts of things. But it's a good way of finding out more about what's happening and how to get engaged. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll introduce myself while my PowerPoint is getting pulled up. So my name is Sasha Land, and I work with the Chesapeake and Coastal Service, which is within Maryland DNR. And I have a unique position there that I work with our Coastal Zone Management, which is a NOAA program that's run through our state. But then I also work with something called the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, which we have unique places around the bay. So we're a place-based system that focuses on the science, the education, and the stewardship of those lands. So we have a location in the Upper Bay in Harford County. We have locations along the Patuxent River in both Anne Arundel on the Anne Arundel County side and then the Prince George's side. And then we have a location down in Somerset County on the Lower Eastern Shore. So what I want to start with is I want to just give you, so while Zoe's talking about the big Chesapeake Bay watershed, I'm going to bring us back here to Maryland and focus on how Maryland, in kind of this, under this big umbrella of coastal or climate change adaptation, and how we're approaching it from the state. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the program that I'm more familiar with, the Coastmark Communities program, and that's really focused on the impact of sea level rise and nuisance flooding and storm surge. And so this is just an illustration, and so we already talked about this, the impacts that we're feeling here in Maryland. So we have flood events, and that's happening now. We know the sea levels are rising. They've risen a foot over the last 100 years. But we also have a lot of urban and suburban areas and these precipitation events. And so we get flooding, stormwater flooding, and so that's having impacts as well. And then the temperatures are rising. So the temperatures are not only rising in the waters of the bay, but they're also rising in the air. So what we've found through some new research through the University of Maryland is that our nighttime temperatures over the course, I think they look back into the records about 130 years. And so over that time frame, we are having more nights that are staying elevated above a certain percentage, and I should know that, but I'm just getting used to that information. So I just want to give you a flavor of what's being done here in Maryland. So we do have the Maryland Climate Change Commission that was started under Governor O'Malley and now is continuing under Governor Hogan. And so there's been a lot of planning efforts and reports, and Zoe was, very involved with that when she worked with the state. And I'm sure that on the mitigation side, some of the greenhouse gas work is being done through the commission. But on the adaptation side, so there was reports that focused on sea level rise, because that is one of the major impacts here in Maryland. But then there are other reports that have come out later that have focused on other sectors, such as, I have a slide for this, but agriculture and here it is. Agriculture, how that impacts health with rising temperatures, how that impacts our resources in the bay, like Zoe was talking about, our forests, our built environments, and then our changes in precipitation. So there has been a lot of reports and planning and thinking about adaptation in the state, and is ongoing. And so underneath the Climate Commission, there's the Adaptation and Response Working Group. So this is a group that meets quarterly, and I just wanted to give you a flavor of some of the things that they were thinking about. So for their meetings in 2016, these were the kind of overarching topics that they were thinking about. So how to get tools and information to local governments. How is climate impacts going to affect the state's economy and where we put our investments? How do we start developing more of the public-private partnerships? So we understand that a lot of these impacts are going to impact private lands and individuals and people like you who are here in the room. So government can't do this alone, and we really need to be thinking about our partners and in the private sector to kind of help address some of the impacts that we are really already feeling. And then looking more into our vulnerable communities that may already be socially vulnerable, but then are kind of disproportionately vulnerable to the other impacts of climate change. And then I just wanted to give you an example of how the state is leading by example. So during Zoe's time with the department and then under Governor O'Malley, there was an executive order that came out that was called the Co-Smart Construction Program. And so what this said is that for all units of state government, so not just DNR, but all of our partner agencies, that we should employ co-smart practices when we are constructing new structures on state property or doing substantial improvements that made them less vulnerable to sea level rise and flood events. And so we wanted to develop, so there's a list of co-smart practices. That's, how that went into the planning and the siting and the design and how it was constructed. And ultimately it was to take these structures out of vulnerable areas. So we felt that the state really needed to lead by example. And there's a whole web page that we could give you the link to that goes into more of the specifics. But here's the part I want to now take us down more to the kind of individual community level. So the program that I specifically work with is the Co-Smart Communities program. And really what we're about is we want to be adaptive, ready, and resilient. And we work with local counties and municipalities and their partners to understand, plan, and prepare for flood events, both now and into the future. And we're all here having to do that because this is where we want to be. I mean, I want to be there. We are very much drawn to our water resources on both sides of the bay and up into the watersheds. But we understand, and especially because this is right down the road, that this is really becoming our new reality. As Zoe said, the research through NOAA is showing that the changes that are happening that now over 50 days, and we're seeing this nuisance flooding, or you'll also hear it referred to as sunny day flooding. So it's not flooding associated with storm events. So the Co-Smart Communities program, really we offer both financial assistance. So we have a competitive grant program that we're in the process of getting ready to review projects that would start in October of 2016. So we offer financial assistance, and then we also offer technical one-on-one assistance to communities as they need it in wherever they are in the planning process. And so we help, provide them resources and tools and training and other information that they might need to start thinking about these issues. But I think the one thing to understand is we're really trying to meet communities where they are. So they already have existing plans that they have to do. So they have hazard mitigation plans that have to be done every 5 years. They have comprehensive plans. They have open space plans. So there's a lot of plans that they already have to do. So we really encourage trying to kind of meet them where they are and figure out how we can enhance those planning opportunities or move the box a little bit. So we might not be redefining the box, but kind of where can we work around the edges to kind of bring this type of information and planning into what they already have to do and make connections between different sectors of local governments. And here's the puzzle piece again. But we recognize that not one sector needs to think about this. It really truly is a puzzle piece. And all these different sectors, whether it's transportation, your emergency preparedness, your land use planning, what's happening along the shoreline and that land-water interface, really all these things need to go together. And we really need to understand that synergy between the built environment and the natural environment, and how can we use our natural resources to kind of I don't want to say fully protect, but they're a buffer between, between the land and the water. And Karl, I'm sure, will dive into that much deeper. And so just to give you an idea on the financial side, so I talked about what we were doing this year, but we've awarded, and I think my number is actually really low because I just did the math more recently for some budget things going on. But I think we're up to closer to $1 million over just the last 5 years. And we've worked with over 20 of the coastal communities in Maryland. And I think we've worked with most of the coastal counties that are considered in Maryland's coastal zone. And I think we have 114 municipalities, and we've worked with over 21 of them. So a project, just to give you a little bit of a deeper dive on the types of projects that we work on, because there isn't a template. So I don't come into a community and say, okay, here's my checklist. Let's just walk through it. We really do kind of want to understand what the community, what the landscape is, if you will. And in Somerset County, I'm working on a place called the Deal Island Peninsula. It's unincorporated. So the government is a partner of ours, but they're not the driver. The local community is the driver of this project. And what we came in working with the University of Maryland, the Research Reserve is part of this, and then myself, and then we have a network of over 50 community members. This community is very independent. That's why they live down in Somerset County on this peninsula. It's not that far from Smith Island of the way the crow flies. And so we are able to get 50 of the residents to come together. And what we wanted to understand is what do they think their vulnerabilities are? And then where do they see the resilience to kind of face some of those vulnerabilities? So this peninsula is very marsh dominated. It's very low, and it's very marsh dominated, but it's also one of the few spots in the bay that has ancient dune structures. So you see that on the Virginia eastern shore, and this is on the bay side. And so there's some really cool features that you don't see in very many areas of the bay. So we've done a deep dive in, and we are coming up with our end goal here is to come up with adaptation options for this community that makes sense to them. And so we're in the middle of doing very intensive kind of one-on-one work with property owners. So this is what makes sense in Deal Island. We don't know if it's going to make sense in other areas of the bay, but we're trying out these different methods to kind of meet people where they are. And to give you a more government kind of perspective on what we're doing in Calvert County. So this is through the hazard mitigation planning, which is something a county has to do. But what Calvert County decided is they wanted to do these small area flood plan. So they realized that in some of their unincorporated parts of Calvert County were highly vulnerable. So your Brooms Island and Breezy Point. So they have a process that they go through with these communities where they they get to know what really the vulnerabilities are. They have community meetings, and many of them to understand when they flooded, how they flooded, and then they come up with a set of recommendations on what they want to do about these flood vulnerabilities. And so all of these, so they have, I think they're on their 4th or 5th plan. So they have also worked with the town of North Beach. So they've moved out of some of the unincorporated areas and now are focused on some of the municipalities. And they're in the process of doing Solomon's Island, which is a kind of bigger undertaking because you have a lot more, it's not just residential there, so you have commercial interests, you have the Maritime Museum, you have the University of Maryland has a biological lab there. So Solomon's Island is kind of bringing all these different issues, and so they're in the process of doing that. But these plans are passed by the commissioners and have led to some adaptation, I guess, projects through Lake of Maryland Emergency Management. So they've bought some properties and torn them down. They've also elevated some properties, but that's what was decided by the community that they felt like was the best path forward. So we, through the CoastSmart program, financially support help through the grants program, financially support Calvert County to do this work. And then more locally, these are two efforts that we've supported through the CoSmart Communities program. So back in 2011, there was a strategic plan on sea level rise done for Anne Arundel County. So the first thing that Anne Arundel County did is they wanted to know where they were vulnerable. So that was a year-long study of really kind of understanding where their low-lying areas are. I mean, I think intuitively we know where some of the low-lying areas are, but they wanted to kind of understand more about what was happening now and then into the future. And then they wanted to say, okay, now, and they focused on the Shady Side area for very obvious reasons because of the nature of the vulnerability. And they felt like a lot of the issues that were being seen in Shady Side would also translate then to the other areas of the county that were vulnerable. So then they spent year 2 really saying, okay, let's get to know Shady Side and really dig into the different issues sector by sector. So this was a pretty internal process in Anne Arundel County. So they brought all the different sectors of government together to do maps and to talk about issues related to like wells and septic systems and flooding, the overland flooding that was happening, as well as the sea level changes. And so then the other effort that you might be more familiar with too is the Annapolis Weather It Together. So this is a really large effort. So we gave some seed money to get that started in Annapolis. And that started out really focusing on the historic part of Annapolis and kind of the historic buildings and doing an inventory to understand if a flood event happened, what would be lost. So under cataloging, what's there and what would be lost if an event happened, and taking photos. But it's emerged into a larger effort within Annapolis. So they're working on their hazard mitigation plan now. So these groups have kind of joined up to kind of help each other in that planning process. And then Annapolis is also interested in becoming part of the community rating system, which is run through FEMA, through the National Flood Insurance Program. So it's a higher regulatory standards. It's a voluntary program, and it's meant for those communities that are part of the flood insurance program to kind of decrease their risk, and then you can also decrease your insurance premiums if you need, like you come into the program at different levels, so you get different percentages based on your points. And so Annapolis is coming together around this community rating system and are hoping that to move forward with that in the next year. And so really just to kind of emphasize, our program is really meeting communities where they are. We can't define at the state what resilience means to you. And so really, that's the emphasis of our program is we want to hear what resilience and what being in climate adaptation makes sense for local communities, and then we'll help kind of meet you where you are. So with that, I'll turn it over to Karl, who will talk about more natural infrastructure.
Hi everyone. Again, while my PowerPoint's getting brought up, I will take a chance to introduce myself. My name is Karl Schrass. I'm the Climate Adaptation Resilience Manager for the National Wildlife Federation. And as the name implies, we are a truly national conservation nonprofit. But we've divided ourselves into regional offices. So I work out here in Annapolis, office in West Annapolis, and I cover the Mid-Atlantic region. And we've defined the Mid-Atlantic as Pennsylvania to North Carolina, and then all the way westward to the Ohio River. So a pretty unique conception of what Mid-Atlantic means. Most of the states in our Mid-Atlantic probably wouldn't consider themselves Mid-Atlantic, but it works for our means. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what adaptation actually looks like on the ground, and really focusing on this idea of natural and nature-based solutions to climate change. So get started. And I know we've already talked about this, but for me, it's easier to start with kind of the impacts of climate change. So as we've already talked about, the one that we probably hear the most about is the rising sea level. And then on top of that, We're going to have coastal storms, which are going to come in, and there's going to be storm surge, wave action, wave energy. We're going to have the heat waves, as I mentioned. We're going to have increasing drought, and then those periods of drought are really going to be punctuated by these extreme precipitation events. So, even if some of the models are saying we're going to see a small increase in precipitation, it's really going to be these events, and then in between you're going to have these periods of dry weather and these periods of drought. So this is a pretty dire graphic, and then even more so when you think about as Annapolitans, as people that choose to live in that area right here, where this all kind of combines. When these things happen, a lot of times in these coastal communities, in these coastal ecosystems, what happens is you end up getting pinched. So from the seaward side, you have sea level rise, which is compounding the impacts of storm surge. And then in storm events, you're obviously having a tremendous amount of rain and precipitation, and that's going to come down, and you end up getting these really extreme flooding events on these coastal communities because the infrastructure is not built to handle it. But also, climate change, I think, needs to be put into context, and especially as conservationists, with our focus on habitat and ecosystems, climate change is driving a lot of things that are going on for a long time. So land use change is one of the things that has been a huge challenge for the conservation movement really since its get-go. I just want to point out a few things here that are going on in our region. So on the bottom there, you see a graph of land use change in Anne Arundel County from 1973 to 2010. And what's really to note there is the growth of the red bar, which is hard to read, but it's developed lands. And you can see essentially what's an equivalent reduction there in the green area, which is forest. So at least in this county, what we've seen is the destruction of a lot of forest, and in place, you're seeing the growth of suburbs, of residential communities, of malls, of strip malls, things like that. Now, kind of coming to the present, we have the map here on the left, and this is the development pressure, so future development pressure, the hot spots in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And what's really, the only thing to note there is how much the orange and the red really jumps out at you. So there's no stopping this trend in the future. The Baltimore, Washington metro area is one of the fastest growing areas around this area. And you can see, even up along the Appalachian Ridge here, you see that even that is orange and red. So those pretty rural areas are under high development pressure. And then, how is this development happening? What's its impact on ecosystem? So when things are developed, they're not these concentrated points. It's really that they're spread out across the landscape. So what you see is this transformation of these large patches, these large integral pieces of nature, and they just get split up into smaller and smaller chunks. We call that fragmentation. So you get smaller and smaller pieces of wild nature, and those small pieces cannot support the wildlife that requires those large acres as habitat. So we come to the kind of the climate adaptation space and the natural and nature-based solution space really from the green side. So as conservationists, the things that we're really focused on is protecting and preserving the natural areas that still exist, is creating new habitat, and especially those areas where it can connect the protected areas. So really focusing on the idea of connectivity to increase overall space and overall habitat. And then also making sure that habitat is of the highest quality both now and will continue to provide the needed habitat for the wildlife into the future. And then there's this other kind of perception, kind of what Sasha was talking about, the people that she works with. So the communities, they have a different set of priorities. So they're really focused on protecting the built infrastructure. They're focused on having a strong economy so people stick around. They're focused on clean air and water to breathe, and they're focused on living in a place that they want to live, in a beautiful spot. So this natural nature-based solution area really works at the intersection of these two. So this is where I'll really be talking about, is where is the connection between ecological and ecosystem resilience and community resilience, and what do those solutions actually look like? So to answer the question I posed here, can climate-smart conservation result in benefits for both wildlife and people? And I argue the answer is yes. So before we get into what that looks like, let's talk about the status quo. And I know this has been talked about a little bit. So here we have, development's really defined by the spread of impervious surfaces. So we've really engineered ourselves into a lot of the problems, and we've tried to engineer ourselves out of them with not so good results. So in the top left there, that's Ellicott City. So that was a 1 in 1,000 year storm, but it was really, or more, but it was really exacerbated by the fact that a lot of the natural landscape had been sealed and had been covered by asphalt and impervious surfaces. So that rainwater that fell wasn't trapped in the landscape, it was really concentrated in these specific areas. And the infrastructure that was put in place 100 years ago was not built in a way to handle that kind of storm. So one of the issues that we deal with when thinking adaptively and asking the climate question with built infrastructure is thinking, is this going to function in 100 years? And sometimes it's hard to know. 100 years prior, we didn't even know about climate change. So it's really thinking about creating systems that can adapt and change over time. That's a real challenge when you're dealing with concrete and steel. Then on the top right there, that's a bulkhead. So one of the things that my work focuses on a lot is the land-water interface and the coastlines of Maryland and the whole region. And just pretty alarming statistic here that just in a 9-year span, approximately 6% of Maryland's coastline was armored. So there's about just over 3,000 miles, I believe, of coastline in the state, and I think right now about 20% of it is armored. So that's a way to reduce erosion, but it comes with a lot of other detrimental effects. So if the land on either side of a bulkhead is not protected, it really just reflects that energy to unprotected areas, and it increases erosion at those spots. And then we see they often fail when they're needed most. So if you have a hurricane come up the bay in high energy events, you see the bulkheads fail, and then the erosion just happens anyway. And also, so for the habitat quality, putting in a wall, as I said, it reflects the energy, and it also scours the bottom right by the bulkhead. So if there's any kind of submerged aquatic vegetation or any kind of habitat there, it's just going to be scoured down, and it's really going to lose all its value. And then in our urban areas, the impervious cover exacerbates extreme heat through the urban heat island effect. So we see that in that Baltimore, and it's interesting to think that it happens at a smaller scale than we usually think of it. So it's really at the micro scale, because if you can see this little dot right here, that's actually Patterson Park. And it's amazing that in the center of Baltimore, even a relatively small area of park can have a real impact on the temperature on the most extreme days. So what are natural nature-based solutions? So there's a number of things that they are. And I guess I should start with the natural, which I didn't get to here. And as conservationists and people like to preserve the environment, that includes everything that exists out there, such as the existing wetlands. Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge is the gem of this region, and it's great for birding and it's great for recreating, but it's also a really valuable piece of natural infrastructure for Dorchester County. Having that huge swath of marsh is really going to buffer it from coastal storms, as long as they can keep up with sea level rise. But it's also, obviously, these things are going in there and creating these natural features. So wetland restoration, dune revegetation, along the Maryland's coast. In the more developed areas, rain gardens, bioswales, those types of projects that want to trap stormwater where it falls and slow its movement into our sewer systems. I'm not sure if you're familiar with combined sewer overflow events, but a lot of sewer systems in the region are the older ones don't separate stormwater from kind of the municipal water stream, and when there's a high rain event, they can kind of combine and exceed the capacity of the stormwater system to manage it and end up dumping raw sewage into our bodies of water. Not a very pleasant thought. And in addition to that, so we have oyster castles. So oyster castles are engineered pieces of concrete. So this is where we really start to get into nature-based. So this is when we're looking at nature for inspiration for how we can address the impacts of climate change. So these are pieces of concrete that oysters can attach to and grow on and kind of be the starting blocks for oyster reefs. And oyster reefs are really effective when they're above the water line at reducing wave energy in high energy environments. And then one that I am intimately involved in, and I'll talk about a little later, and is extremely popular here in Maryland, is living shorelines. So instead of using bulkheads, instead of using riprap to reduce erosion on your property, in Maryland, a lot of people are choosing, we can talk about they're kind of being encouraged, strongly encouraged to choose living shorelines to address those measures. And living, so that's usually a blend of this rock to absorb the energy, and then marsh plantings behind it to increase the habitat value and hold the shoreline in place. And then these things can be combined. So this bottom one, here we have a hybrid approach. So this incorporates both natural and man-made solutions. So you don't have to choose one or the other, but it's really, you can have a mix of green and gray, as we say, approaches to community resilience. So of course, you know, as a conservationist, you go in here and you talk to people who have been putting in bulkheads for 100 years, and you tell them that, you know, you can achieve the same thing with a marsh, and they're going to look at you a little crazy, and they're going to wonder if that really works. And we can now pretty certainly say they do work, and there have been a number of really impactful studies on this. So during Hurricane Sandy, there's a study that showed that areas that had intact salt marshes, they had $625 million reduction in flood damage versus those places that had kind of filled their wetlands. So it proves that working with nature really pays off in the long run. And also, there have been other studies showing exactly what I was talking about earlier, is that bulkheads in storm events have proved less resilient and less effective than natural marshes. And of course, another thing to think about is in these storm events, if there is a damage to a marsh, it's a living system, and it has the ability to self-heal. Whereas if your bulkhead or your piece of hard infrastructure gets damaged, that's going to come out of your pocketbook, and you're going to have to pay someone to come in there and repair or replace that. So that's one of the points lower down. Oyster reefs I already mentioned. So yeah, like I said, natural nature-based solutions, we're proving that they can actually be more affordable, both in the upfront costs. So we're proving now that living shorelines can be more affordable than putting in an equal length of bulkhead along your shoreline. And that in the long term, they're going to require less maintenance because because they're a living system, and they have this ability to adapt and self-heal over time. And of course, by utilizing these living systems, they're going to be more resilient to climate change. Because you don't have to necessarily think as far in the future if you have a living natural shoreline that has the ability to migrate upland and self-heal after storm events. So yes, they really do work. And some of the partnerships that National Wildlife Federation has created in this field, I think really prove that. So, you know, as seen on TV, sales pitch, I would say now, but wait, there's more, and give you a 1-800 number to donate to NWF. So in addition to, you know, reducing erosion and doing the thing that you're going to put it in the ground for, you have a goal when you want to do these projects. It'll achieve that goal, but in addition, you'll have a number of co-benefits. So it can improve water quality, it can restore habitat, it supports recreational and commercial fisheries. As Zoe was saying, SAB marshes, there's a critical habitat for juvenile blue crab, perch, rockfish, all the things that we associate with coming out of the bay. Obviously, if you can do it on your property in a nearby park, it's going to improve the scenic value. People would rather look at a natural marsh than they would at a piece of concrete when they go and recreate on the bay. And then with wetland restoration especially, it actually sequesters carbon. So you can really adapt while mitigating the impacts of climate change as well. And in the business, we refer to these additional benefits as ecosystem services. You might be familiar with that term, but it's all of the benefits that we as a human species derive from the environment we live in. So what do we do as National Wildlife Federation to promote these projects? So at the most local scale, we actually put these projects on the ground. So the picture here on the screen is a project that I put in on the Eastern Shore in cooperation with Maryland DNR and Queen Anne's County. So this is about 1,300 linear feet of shoreline on the Chester River. So we're looking out on the Chester River there. This is a county-owned parcel, a county-owned park, and it was experiencing some pretty bad erosion. So you can't really see it here, but where the tree line stops here, there's about a 3 to 4 foot cliff And you can see that some of the trees have already fallen in. There are a lot of exposed root balls, and the county was worried that over time they were just slowly losing public land. And this is a venue that's often rented out for weddings and events, and it's a revenue generator for the county, so they're also interested in protecting their investment and their future revenue they get from this. So what we did was we wanted to use this site to pilot what we call a climate smart living shoreline. So if you remember on the first living shoreline slide I showed you, there is what we call a sill, so that pile of rock, and then behind it there are marsh grasses. But if you look at this, you might not even think that you might walk there and think that's natural. I mean, the grass would be a little higher in a couple of years, but you might go there and think that, that's always been that way. There's really no sign of human intervention there if you hadn't seen that left picture. So what we did to make this climate smart and adaptive was that, as I was talking about previously, we see any kind of permanent fixed structure as it's by definition not adaptive. And because this is a relatively low energy environment, we didn't have to break a lot of large waves. What we did is we incorporated the structure within the shoreline. So we spread out a layer of about fist-sized stones on top of the shoreline. So I don't know if you're familiar with kind of the pictures of the beaches in England, where they're really rocky and stony. You don't really want to lay your blanket down there. But that's kind of what this beach actually looks like down between the low and high water lines. So those rocks are going to be heavy enough to not be washed off, and they're going to provide kind of a protective blanket cover on the sand. And then all these little green specks on there are plugs that we planted. So those will grow over the next couple of years, and then they will also provide an additional benefit of kind of layering the sand that we put in there and acting as a blanket. So it's kind of this idea of these multiple lines of defense a little bit, where you have the rocks that'll break the most intense energy, and then the marsh grasses will kind of lay on top of the sand as a blanket and hold that shoreline in place. And then as sea levels rise, as I said, this is the county park, so there's no hard infrastructure to prevent upland migration. So we're really interested in seeing the site in 20, 30, 50 years to see how this marsh has shifted and changed and hopefully migrated inland as sea levels rise. We're not going to stop the fact that sea levels are rising, but as conservationists, we want to make sure that the habitat that we create today exists into the future. So we're hoping, and we designed this so that the marsh could migrate inland. So that's one of the projects that I've worked on at the local scale. And zooming out a little bit, we obviously, as I said, I work at the regional office. We also work at the regional scale. So what we do at the regional scale is we really see ourselves as conveners. We're not place-based organization. We're not tied to one state or one community or one natural resource. So what we like to do is we like to facilitate conversation between those organizations that are, because there's a lot of really amazing work going on in this region, in Maryland by DNR, in Delaware, DNREC's doing a lot of similar projects. In Virginia, the state's doing similar things, and there's academic institutions, there's smaller NGOs, there's marine contractors, there's all kinds of people that are interested in this work, but they're not always talking to each other because everyone's very busy on a day-to-day basis and doesn't have time just to constantly be making rounds on the phone and say, hey, what's new? How are your projects doing? Have you learned anything new from their successes or their failures? So what we do is we try and create spaces and places and times for people to get together and share that knowledge, so that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel constantly when we're doing these projects, and we're learning from what New York's doing in their area, and we're learning from what Virginia's doing, and at a national scale, the Chesapeake Bay can be learning from what Puget Sound is doing, or a lot of the restoration efforts that are going on in the Gulf now, or in San Francisco Bay, because really these geographies aren't so different, and we're all facing a lot of the same challenges, and could really move forward a lot quicker by learning from each other and just talking with each other. And then at the national level, as a national organization, what we do is one of the things we do is we work with industry. So like I said, this kind of gets back to the question: do natural and nature-based solutions really work? And I think that the fact that we were contacted by an international reinsurance company. So reinsurers insure insurance companies. Yeah, yes, that's a business. It's like a shadow industry.
It's a huge business.
But so we worked with them to identify a number of case studies around the region, or around the nation, sorry, where people were using natural features to reduce risk to community infrastructure and built environment. Because what they want to reduce the amount of buildings and things that they insure that are exposed to risk. And what we want as a National Wildlife Federation are more intact, more healthy ecosystems. So we identified those places in the country where that taken place, including here in the Chesapeake Bay with a lot of our living shoreline work. And I think that we make weird bedfellows, a bunch of tree huggers, and probably the most rational group of human beings you'll ever meet, insurance-minded people who, if the numbers don't add up, they're not interested. So the fact that they were interested in working with us to talk about nature-based solutions shows that really industry is already there. These questions are not really open anymore if insurers are calculating this into their models. And then also we work with a lot of the federal agencies as well. So one of the things we did that really put, I think, National Wildlife Federation's name on the map as one of the leaders in climate adaptation and conservation was a Climate Smart Conservation Guide. You can see there the people that we worked with were from NOAA, worked with EPA, National Park System, USGS, and Army Corps. So this is about 3 years ago. This is a relatively young field. We realized that a lot of these agencies that are responsible for millions of acres across our country were not incorporating climate adaptation into their decision making. So we worked with them and developed this climate smart conservation cycle to work with them to develop an adaptive management model for the lands in the United States and ways to strategically and have a standardized format for incorporating climate change into decision making for natural resources. So I know this group, I was here on Saturday, I know this group likes to know, what can we do about it? You're here, you're volunteering your time, you want to get engaged, especially in the policy area. One thing I want to say is that as a Marylander, you should already be proud of what your state's doing, because you're really a national leader in living shorelines and promoting natural and nature-based solutions. So in 2008, Maryland passed the Living Shorelines Law, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but what it says is that any new shoreline stabilization project that goes in the ground, you need to prove that a living shoreline would not work in your environment. And there are environments where they're not appropriate. If you're on the main stem of the bay and there's 30 miles of fetch between you and the next shore, the wave action there is going to require something pretty hard to reduce or eliminate erosion of your property. But in a lot of these places, along the rivers, along some of the less exposed areas, living shorelines can really be the best thing for the environment, for your wallet, and for the long-term sustainability of your property. So that's been in law since 2008, and it's been a model for a lot of other states. So Virginia has taken this and copied it and developed something similar, and a lot of other states are looking to Maryland as leaders in this space. Something more relevant to what's going on today is that there's a Senate Bill 0108. It's right now in the House, and it would provide tax credits for non-structural shoreline projects, so living shoreline projects. And it seems to be getting good responses from the senators on that, so hopefully that will move forward. And then I respect you all for being so focused on mitigation, because I feel like personally, sometimes mitigation is so daunting, and you think to yourselves, what can I do as an individual? I can turn off my lights, I drive my Prius around, probably more than I should anyway, but you're just one small drop in an ocean. But what I like about adaptation is that you can really model these actions and have a real impact on your surrounding environment. And I think one of the keys to the future is individuals, is private landowners and residential landowners. So I just want to point out that 37% of land in Anne Arundel County is residential. And 96% of Maryland's shoreline is in private hands. So for us as conservationists, one of the keys to scaling up these approaches that we've been piloting on public lands and in some of the more rural areas is working with individuals, working with private landowners, to have them implement them on their properties. Because if we want to take this to scale, we're going to need to have better landowner outreach. And I think that, yeah, individuals, what we do is really key to making Maryland more resilient to climate change. And I just want to say thank you, and I know that this has been a wild number of weeks to be working in climate change or to be passionate about climate change. So I just want to leave everyone with this beautiful poem by Wendell Berry about seeking solace and serenity in nature. So, yeah, I guess that concludes all of our presentations, and we'll be open for a Q&A.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to take you away, please.
It says, okay, I'll start it.
I'll read it. When despair grows in me, and I wake in the middle of the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world, and am free.
Thank you, Karl. So you've all been very patient. We'll bring our speakers up here and engage in question and answers. Please speak up so that everybody can hear.
Can we turn off the?
I have a question for Karl.
Yeah.
You have to have that blasting.
You have a picture of two pictures before and after.
There we go.
The project, living shoreline.
Yeah.
On the after, could you show us where, point to where that tree plant was?
Oh, yeah. What is this? Yeah. I think we turned the projector off and I shut down the PowerPoint. So it was really, I guess.
I want to slide.
Did you bring sand and rocks in?
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
And push them up against that cliff?
Exactly. So what we did is, there was a cliff, and then there's a small kind of sand beach at the bottom of the cliff between low, depending on the tide. So what we did is, and what you do a lot of times in the shoreline, because you're dealing with sites that have these cliffs that have been carved into them by the wave energy. Like the site that Zoe showed also had kind of that cliff-like formation. So we regrade that, and the grade that you put in there depends on the grain size of what you're using. So obviously the bigger a piece of stone or sand is, kind of the steeper it can be. So we use a lot of sand, and that's why you see that really long slope that stretches out into the river. Yeah, but yeah, so it's hard to see on that photo. I agree where the cliff was.
Are you up there?
Yeah, were they? Did you put them in your documents?
Yeah.
Did you use Spartina and did you have offshore breakwaters?
So were no offshore breakwaters. That's one of the things that we piloted there as thinking, like trying to innovate on the living shoreline. Is a lot of times they have that sill, which is essentially a little breakwater, really. They have the marsh grass plantings behind it. We did no sill, and then we used these cobblestones, and we looked at the system, like the existing system. We wanted to make it, and I think I don't think any of us have mentioned that yet, really. When we talk about doing adaptation, one of the most important things to do is look at the site where you're putting the project in and making sure the approach that you're proposing and that you put in the ground is appropriate for that site. And so to do that at this project.
Because that looked like a medium action. I'm kind of surprised you didn't use offshore breakwaters.
Yeah, it's,
Medium energy, not high.
I don't have the fetch numbers. I don't have them in my mind right now. But it's just north of, it's a little bit northwest of Centerville on the Chester River. So we weren't exposed to the main bay at all.
Right.
I would say maybe like a mile-ish, maybe not even. I'm not sure where the fetch was, but it was.
It's also like a natural kind of, it's not, I wouldn't call it a cove, but there is kind of a natural, that's kind of, it's, I don't know, it's kind of tucked in like a curve in the river. So it's a pretty interesting, I mean, you can drive there and walk there.
I did a shoreline restoration for my community. I have another one to do. I'm a waterfront.
Question in the back.
Oh, okay.
No.
I'm sorry, I didn't get your name from the community.
Sasha.
Just for example, the Deal Island project you were working on, can you tell me, when you go in and work with them, what kind of risk parameters do you give them for their planning process? In terms of, for instance, what kind of range of sea level rise do they have to work with in terms of how they plan for the future?
Yeah, so we actually worked with the Eastern Shore GIS Cooperative, who has, they have a flood risk index. So we are looking at, so it was 1.4 feet by 2050. And so then they use LIDAR and this whole calculated index that actually was done for State Highway. And then he did additional work for us on the peninsula. So the risk factor was the 1.4 feet. And that took into some account the projections into the future with the emissions, so that there was some calculations there that was done through the group, Eastern Shore. It's Salisbury University, Michael Scott.
1.4 additional feet from now, or 1.4 total from some time period?
So he took 2015 levels.
Okay.
And then went forward.
Thanks.
Okay, Carol, and then we'll go in the back.
I think it was in the community then, that's Sasha.
Yes.
The impression I got, so my impression might be wrong. So, the impression I got was when you're working with communities that you let them decide what makes most sense for their community. I like that. At the same time, it feels like if there isn't a threshold or minimum of something, then they could decide what is good for my community or where we are right now really isn't going to have, good long-term effects. So am I making sense? Did I misunderstand it?
Yes. No, I mean, yes, no. So from coming in as the state, we're not coming in with some prescribed way that we think a local community will adapt. And we don't have a prescribed answer coming in. So we help guide through that process. And you're right, some of the things that are decided, some of this is very new, and it's not like we have a lot of communities that we can look to say they got it right. So we're it's that adaptive management, right? So we learn as we go, and we can see where things have worked in other communities, and so we're giving guidance, and we're showing them kind of other examples from maybe around the state or from around the country, but you're right in the sense that we're not coming in with a certain thresholds or parameters and saying you must do this. But
Right, not that you must, but here are some criteria that if you're really looking for long-term this or whatever it is, that it would behoove most communities to meet. Or is your goal, as you get more experience, to be able to say, here's some criteria that would be, you know what I'm saying?
yeah, sure. I mean, I think we do give suggestions. So we certainly can't tell a community that they need to adopt freeboard, which is elevation of your houses, in your most vulnerable areas. But we do put that out there as a strategy for reducing your risk. It's up to the community because that can tend to be a very political issue, that has to go through your county commissioners and whatnot. That, that is one thing to look at collectively in your most vulnerable areas. Another suggestion that we can put out there is maybe consider managed retreat and how that might go. Certainly from a state perspective, we're not saying that makes sense for your community, but as a community, much like they've done in the Brooms Island and other parts of Calvert County, I mean, they made some decisions as a community that there were certain houses that they felt needed to be elevated, and then there were certain houses that were bought out. because of their continued vulnerability. So those, those were suggestions that were made by not only the program at DNR, but other state agencies, who were part of those conversations. So I hope that helps.
Lady in the back and then Sarah.
The figure was for Karl, the 96%, I was kind of surprised to hear that much was private.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it
I
bothers
can't
me,
hear.
I was wondering what percentage or how much of that 96% is attached to land that's either farmland or designated for no development?
I haven't seen the number broken down into that level of detail. I've only seen the 96%. I believe, so the numbers that I'm familiar with are just for overall kind of shoreline ownership. I think Maryland is 96, Virginia's even slightly higher, I think it's 98. And I think nationwide it's around 65% of the coastline is in private hands. It is interesting though, like if you compare, so Maryland's really high on that spectrum obviously, but Delaware's a lot lower. Delaware has a lot of their shoreline is in public hands. Obviously it's a smaller state, it's a much smaller shoreline. But a lot of, if you look at a map of Delaware, you can just see, like on Google Maps even, like a lot of it's green areas. So there's the National Seashore, there's Cape Henlopen State Park, and working your way up, there's just a series of, there's Prime Hook, there's Bombay Hook, the National Wildlife Refuges. So there's a lot of, there's kind of an amalgamation of federal, state, local, and then kind of nonprofit ownership. There are some interesting maps out there if you're interested in looking at protected lands, but I don't know the number for shoreline itself. Yeah.
Okay, Sarah.
So I have a question for you, Sasha. Do you work with communities who are already worried about the problem? And as just a continuance of that, what do you do about communities that aren't worried about the problem? I mean, right, so recent surveys show that on the Eastern Shore, maybe 35% of people think that climate change is going to impact them during their lifetime. And yet I have burned into my mind the picture from the Climate Commission, I think 2013, analysis of sea level rise, where there's those blue areas that are going to be inundated, and there's Crisfield right in the blue area. And I actually went to the Crisfield city website to see if they had a plan. And I think I did this maybe a year ago, and all I could find on their city website was a plan for revitalizing their marina. And so, what do you do when you have a community that is in the crosshairs, yet isn't thinking, I need to seek DNR's help on adapting? Because you can't just let that community lead, unless you just are saying, we're not gonna do anything until you come to us. It's a fine line, you see what I mean?
Right, so what I will say is that websites aren't always updated,
Good.
which is good to know. So not every community is gonna have a plan that says, here's how I plan for flooding, but that doesn't mean they're not doing anything. So in Crisfield, because of certain situations,
Well, I don't know a thing about Crisfield,
Well, no.
so I'll just say that right now.
but I will just kind of say, just to kind of add to their point, there's kind of these building blocks that need to happen within certain communities, like updating their floodplain ordinances, for instance, which are outdated in certain communities in Maryland. And so there's some foundational steps that communities need to take place to kind of get them over the hump to start thinking kind of more of these longer term impacts.
Right.
So the program that I work with is kind of balancing that with this, especially these lower capacity communities that may not have the same resources that we have here, let's say in Anne Arundel County, is we're really trying to understand what are some of those foundational things that need to happen in order just to kind of bring them up to current speed.
Right.
And then we can kind of get them into the next phase of conversation about like, okay, so you guys, Crisfield has current flooding. To their credit, their new public library is elevated. It's in a highly vulnerable area, so we can talk about whether it should have been placed there in the first place, but that's a different conversation. But it is elevated. And so, there's baby steps. I will say on the Eastern Shore that even though you may not see it in their websites, through the hazard mitigation plans, flooding and sea level rise is going to start coming up. There's also a partnership called the Eastern Shore Climate Adaptation Partnership. It's mostly government staff from a lot of different sectors and nonprofits who are part of that group. And that group is growing. And so I think there is a lot of movement. It's just not always evident on websites, and there's movement within the grassroots efforts, and then there's movement within the local government structure. So I hope that answered your
Yeah, I'm happy to
question.
hear that. There's actually, what you're saying is there's a process that's required to get communities to the point where they can really make use of your services.
Yes, or others, you know,
Yeah.
because it's not just mine. I mean,
Right,
and, you know, I have partners in other state agencies or even, you know, in NGOs, but even getting them to the point then they can, you know, start thinking about kind of future risks.
Question for Zoe. What effect on the Chesapeake Bay program would there be if President Trump's proposed budget was enacted?
Yeah, I can't answer that question. I'm sorry. I just can't.
Because you don't know, or can't because you choose not to?
I choose not to, right? So any budget questions we're not sure about, but those are not something for staff to answer at this point.
I'd like to follow up on this last but one question. Do you, in meeting these communities, what do you do with people who say they don't believe in global warming?
So we don't really focus on that. You know, I'm not there to convince people about whether global warming is happening or not. We focus on the risks that those communities are facing now. So a lot of those communities that I work in are facing flood risks, they're facing erosion, and that's what we focus on, to be honest.
Well, I find it slightly contradictory in the sense that either you're working on the assumption that global warming is taking place, or it's not taking place. And you've got existing problems, maybe you have that. That's quite different from you're going to have even worse problems.
So in Deal Island, for instance, we have a whole team of University of Maryland sociologists and anthropologists who are kind of working through the understanding of how that community thinks about climate change and why it's happening, or the changes in the system that they're seeing. And so I kind of leave it up to them to have those conversations. Me as a planner and kind of where I sit, I really focus on, you know, we're doing a lot of work on the flood problems that are already happening. So we habitually, monthly, they have roads that have this much water on top of them. And so that is what it is. And we have put the maps forward, you know, in that sense, we have shown them the flood risks, you know, based on vulnerability into the future, you know, of what their roads and their infrastructure and their houses might look like in 2030 and 2050. So we put that information out there, but again, it's I'm not really there to convince them on what the drivers are, you know, whether those are man-made drivers or not. That's just not, you know, because of who I work for. Karl might,
I think that a lot of times in the adaptation space, and even if people are on board with climate change, like it just helps to make it very tangible and present for them. Because even if they agree with climate change, they want to know how it's going to impact them. You know, when it comes to adaptation, what can we do to address the impacts on me and on my community? So then, like Sasha said, when you go into communities that are either against climate change or just so another area that NWF works and does some of our conservation work is in the inner city of Baltimore, and these are people in communities that are on the front lines of climate change. I mean, all the studies show it's the vulnerable communities, it's the people that already don't have access to resources that are going to be especially impacted in Baltimore or impacted by climate change. Like, for example, those communities in Baltimore. But at the same time, these people have other concerns in their lives other than climate change and environmental conservation. So when we go in there and we want to do work that's going to reduce the impacts of climate change on them, we don't need to talk about the global system. We're talking about the fact that they're getting water in their basement and that they're going to have extremely hot days in the summer that are going to be dangerous for their grandparents and their babies and things like that. And then we propose solutions to those problems. We don't always tie it back into, we don't always bring it back to global climate change. we know why we're doing what we're doing, and it's almost the ends justify the means kind of thing, where if we're doing something that's going to improve the overall resiliency and adaptability of these communities, it doesn't matter to us if they believe in climate change. They're people, they need to we're helping the people. And like Sasha said, you have to meet people where they are, or else it's just not going to go anywhere. And as what the things that we put in the ground in the natural nature-based features space, those things need to be maintained, and they need to be viewed positively if they're going to remain to be effective. So, the easiest way one of the easier ways we found to do that is, to connect that to the actual firsthand experiences of the people. That makes sense.
I saw Kim and then what?
It's interesting that you keep on, I know you mentioned the 96% of the shoreline in Anne Arundel County being private based, and there seems to be a lot of discussion about working with individual communities, working with individual property owners, whether it be a private entity or a public entity. But what about working with working broader scale and requiring that when building codes are established? I know you said that you sounded like this when you said maybe you didn't when you said that Maryland is at the forefront of this and we're really a leader in this. But these living shorelines, I mean, we've known about hardening shorelines for I don't know, at least 3 decades. It used to be called New Jersification of the shoreline, and we live on the shore, and you still see people putting up bulkheads. And I believe that ordinance that you were talking about only applies to new work on the shoreline. So if you have a hardened shoreline, you're able to reestablish it over and over again. Right. And most of these shorelines are, they're patches. They're and they're right next to each other. So if you're not going, if there isn't going to be some sort of broad scale change with the building code, I mean, if we do something to our patch of shoreline that is that long, and our neighbor, has a hard wall, it's not going to do anything. So it's interesting to work on the individual community and but if we don't get some broader scale change where where building codes are required to take into account some of these considerations and say, no, if you're building something that's going to be here for 30 years, you've got to be looking at this. You've got to be looking at, I think it's going to be really hard if you're just, scratching away at individuals.
Yeah. So there has been movement on the national level, which a lot of NGOs, including National Wildlife Federation, have been supportive of, especially the shoreline space. So when it comes to shorelines, as you probably know as a shoreline owner, and you want to do something, there's multiple layers of permitting that are involved in that. So, in a lot of places there's local jurisdiction, there's state jurisdiction, and there's U.S. Army Corps jurisdiction because you're in an navigable waterway. And the U.S. Army Corps just recently, so they've been kind of the slowest mover. I mean, they're such a massive organization, and shorelines are such a drop in the bucket as compared to what the other things that they kind of, they just have so much that they deal with. But there's been a loud and kind of annoying enough group of living shorelines people that have been pestering them for long enough. And, in their credit, there's been kind of a subgroup within them that has been really forward thinking on this. And now there's a general permit for living shorelines to the nationwide scale. So that it's a blanket permit for the nation. So that does definitely lower the regulatory burden. And so some of the work that we've done has been talking with marine contractors for interest and saying, why aren't we doing more of these things? And there's a lot to unpack as to why. And in a lot of these shoreline communities, you're going to call your neighbor who has a bulkhead and see who did his bulkhead. He's going to give you that person, and then you're going to talk one-on-one with them, and then you're going to do it. And for people like the conservation community or anyone else who's trying to promote living shorelines, it's hard to inject yourself into that conversation. So obviously legislating it, you can try and legislate it in, and we are working on that. So, we're always trying to improve what Maryland has going on, but you're always coming up against legislative realities to get these things passed. The grandfather clause is in there. They weren't going to be able to legislate I mean, I wish that would be great. If they were in every environment where they were appropriate, that would be fantastic, and that's the dream. So I think that we're just trying to get it at multiple scales. I don't want to say we are working at the national level. We are working with the Army Corps and those types of organizations to push for permanent changes. We're working to reform the National Flood Insurance Program, which is completely unsustainable and not based in any kind of realistic assessment of risk. But then at the same time, you have to balance that with what are the impacts going to be on actual human beings and actual communities that have been living in places like Eel Island for 300 years. And how do you balance that against the fact that maybe in some of these places people shouldn't be living there anymore? I mean, there's a lot, ethics, there's a lot, you get into a lot very quickly. So I guess it's a little long-winded answer, just trying to say that we operate these multiple scales because we think that there's short and long-term solutions at each scale. And
I mean, and a lot of us work in these pivot points, like Karl's saying. I mean, so the programs that I'm doing is at the individual community level, but that's where a lot of the stuff bubbles up so that, you know, you're not just hearing it in one community. You really have to understand some impacts that some of these policy level decisions will be made. I mean, on the shorelines, there are a lot of rivers that have water keepers around here that are much more intimately understanding about what's happening on their river system. You know, so there's groups out there that, you know, can look collectively across our different rivers to say, here's what, you know, shoreline hardening is looking like for us, or, you know, how do we change that conversation? And then those are the groups that can help, you know, bubble some of those things, you know, that kind of become, you know, more of a policy level, you know. But I think it's important to maintain that connectivity between what's happening at the local level and impacting people's lives, you know, and then bubble some of that up, but then also, you know, bring the policy down. So sorry, I just wanted to add that in.
And I think if you look at like the situation, you know, you kind of view policy change as like the be all end all, but it's not always that way. Those things can change. So I think that, you know, we want to just build a conservation ethic and have this really a part of how people view their connection to their land. And I mean, like their property as part of a larger ecosystem and what that means. And that might be a longer and more sustainable kind of way forward. That some maybe that than just having a really like well-written and strong policy to promote these activities.
I actually drafted the Living Shoreline Act. Little known fact. So, you know, one thing to keep in mind with these policies is sometimes they evolve over time. And so one thing that act fixed in 2008 that often gets forgotten is that prior to then, property owners had the right to reclaim lost land. So not only could they put in a shoreline, they could put the shoreline out 50 feet and fill behind it. So it fixed something that was very critical in our state law in terms of preventing owners from reclaiming all of this lost land within the Chesapeake and really damaging these coastal habitats. So it fixed that, but in trying to get it passed, there's always gives and takes, right? In any legislative process, we see it play out all the time. And in the case of the Living Shoreline Act, I'm not going to tell you it's perfect because it does have some flaws. But at that time, we didn't have any mapping that could really show where living shorelines were suitable. And we didn't have a process, we couldn't articulate during the legislative process what a waiver could look like and how we would undertake that. So we had to define in the statute how we were going to establish this waiver process and then develop the criteria for siting and where living shorelines would be suitable. So it kind of launched another process, and it was sort of a negotiation that obviously happens when you draft legislation, but we had to allow for a waiver and that waiver to evolve. And we lost a little control about how that waiver would play out and how it's now evolved over time and the waiver process works. But it did, you know, there probably could be some fixes to it, but it really did start and put in place in motion a fix in state law that we desperately needed. So just a little history there. There's always more to this story. I just thought I'd offer that.
Wes? Excuse me, two questions. The first one's real short. This 1,300-foot mitigation, how much did that cost and who paid for it?
It's about $250,000. It was cooperation. So DNR has a zero-cost loan program for living shorelines. So that was where that's kind of a long story. So that's how the project started. So we had funding from a foundation, and DNR matched that funding with a zero-cost loan to the county to do this living shoreline. The county ended up choosing to pay for it themselves. They didn't end up taking the loan, but it was private foundation money matched with
public-private cooperation.
Exactly.
For $250,000 for that.
Exactly. Oh, and, yeah, sorry. While we're here, to get back to the question that was like the first question about where the cliff is. Did you mean the right photo?
Yeah.
Okay. So exactly. So we filled and graded. So we filled in that cliff. So this line of trees was all taken out because it was literally sitting on where that cliff was, and most of those root balls were half in the ground, half exposed. Those are all removed. These trees are still there. I think it's just the camera angle, but this is generally the same spot. So you can see probably from around here, this is all fill in sand.
But some of that is was existing that you just.
Yeah, we kind of pushed it in. Yeah, we kind of pushed it in.
Because that's kind of the balance, is it's very expensive, obviously, to bring in.
Yeah.
If you can grade it down, then that seems like that would help.
Yes.
Okay, but the second part of the question, or the second question is much more abstruse, and that is, you've touched upon some of this, and that's the role of the insurance industry in this. Obviously, if you have the resources and you're within, you're keeping within the intent of the law and the letter of the law, then there are certain things that you can do. If you're willing to assume that risk and underwrite it yourself, and if anything happens and your property gets damaged and you have the resources to fix it, you can approach that problem. But for most people, they rely on insurance. And isn't it true that the insurance industry is going to be a huge driver in this in the future? Because as you said, they're getting a lot smarter about the fact that it may not be such a good idea to develop waterfront property.
Yep.
You know, even in an urban environment, let alone throughout the state of Maryland. So I just think that the landscape is going to change immensely because of the impact of the insurance industry on all of this.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's kind of the short answer to it. The biggest change that we can make in the U.S. is reforms to the National Flood Insurance Program, which is really an insurance. It's not connected to like real insurance. It's not really based on risk. It's a result of congressional negotiations and isn't rooted really in the risks that the properties that they are insuring face. And there's interesting, I could talk later about this, but
But we're getting smarter.
The Coastal Barrier Resources Act provides a really good comparison of areas where like barrier islands have been split in half, literally, with areas that cannot be insured under the National Flood Insurance Program and areas that can. And the resulting development is pretty phenomenal to see, or the lack of development compared to development. Yeah.
So I can tell folks are getting kind of anxious. Listen, you haven't asked a question,
I have
Carol.
one question, and then
So Sarah, can you come up and talk to the speakers afterwards? You had a question.
Yeah, I want to talk to you after.
All right, okay, so Carolyn,
Okay,
question,
I
and then
actually asked-
it'll be the end.
okay, I have to ask you later, Sasha, but your grant program, is it a matching grant program for community shoreline restoration? And I mean, maybe you're working it with, what is her name, Claudia Donegan and Megan Granado, is it?
So I work with Megan. So Megan's part of the grant can be, so we have two tracks. We have one that's more for planning, and that's under CoastSmart. And then Megan manages that's kind of more focused on green infrastructure. And so that can be used for on-the-ground projects. But my part of it can only be used for kind of understanding and planning.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, thanks everybody, good questions.